Hi, my name is Karl Perrin. I'm here actually as a representative of the Unitarian Church of Vancouver. So I was on the faith panel, but now I'm on the health panel, but I'm not going to talk about health. I'm going to talk about something that hasn't been mentioned much, money, and the role of money. And the way that we function in the Unitarian Church is by democracy, and we recently voted in a new minister coming this fall, unanimous vote of our congregation to have him as our new minister. I'm going to read you a early draft of a resolution that I hope our congregation will pass in the fall after we have had sufficient time for education and amendment of the resolution. Whereas the Unitarian Church of Vancouver, as a member of the Canadian Unitarian Council, adheres to the CUC's 8 principles, the first of which states, we affirm and promote the inherent worth and dignity of every person, and the 7th of which calls us to, quote, respect the interdependent web of all existence, of which we are a part. Whereas our new 8th principle encourages us to, quote, affirm and promote individual and communal action that accountably dismantles racism and systemic barriers to full inclusion in ourselves and our institutions. And 3, whereas our UCV vision states, quote, as Unitarians, we are dedicated to spiritual growth, social justice, and reverence for nature and all life. We embody these values through worship, ethical action, artistic expression, and religious education for all ages that aim to connect hearts, heads, and hands. And 4, whereas the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, signed by the Canadian government, promotes, quote, free, informed, and prior consent by Indigenous peoples before intrusion on their traditional territories. And 5, whereas climate change threatens billions of humans, wildlife, and ecosystems during this century, with food and water shortages, war, displacement, and unbearable heat, as well as the collapse of civilization. And 6, whereas Indigenous people in Arctic regions and people of color in the Earth's tropic zones are disproportionately impacted by climate change. And 7, whereas the production and marketing of fossil fuels by fossil fuel corporations and their consumption largely by people in the temperate zones, is the major cause of climate change in the present. And 8, whereas the 5 major Canadian banks are preeminent funders of fossil fuel corporations. And 9, whereas Canada is and has been among the worst climate change contributing nations on a per capita basis. Therefore, be it resolved that the Unitarian Church of Vancouver is in solidarity with those Indigenous peoples who oppose fossil fuel mining and infrastructure. The Wet'suwet'en, for example, in terms of the Coastal GasLink, and the Tsleil-Waututh in terms of the Trans Mountain Pipeline on their traditional territories. That we oppose individual and bank investment in fossil fuel mining, production, transportation, and marketing, leading to fossil fuel consumption and global warming. And that we encourage our members, and in your faith groups and your organizations, perhaps you can adapt this to think of ways that you can encourage your members who bank at the 5 major Canadian banks to move their financial business elsewhere. And 4, that we encourage our members holding mutual funds with significant investments in fossil fuel corporations or in the 5 major Canadian banks which fund them, and RBC is number 1 in the world in terms of funding fossil fuels, move their investments to financial instruments with lower or no investments in fossil fuel corporations and the 5 major Canadian banks. And I did that last week. The mutual funds that I was holding were fossil-free, but they had 12% banks. So I moved them to mutual funds with less than 1% banks. That we encourage our church president, with the help of the Unitarian Church of Vancouver Environment, IBPOC, the Indigenous Black People of Color Plus Allies team, and social justice team, to communicate this resolution to elected officials, Indigenous peoples, and journalists, as well as financial, environmental, IPPOC, social justice, and faith groups in Canada.